Welcome to Relaxing Revenge Storytelling. I'm your host, and tonight's story is a real treat.
My name is Roisin Hogan. I'm 31 years old, and I'm a pediatric home health nurse in Galveston, Texas, which means I spend my days in other people's living rooms, suctioning track tubes and counting respirations and teaching exhausted parents how to read a pulse oximeter at 3 a.m. It was a Tuesday in late March, the kind of Tuesday where the Gulf air comes in heavy and salt thick before a storm, and I was warming a bottle of whole milk for my 4-year-old son Kieran at my in-laws' kitchen counter, standing under the recessed lights at Gerald and Diane Maddox's house, surrounded by the laughter of a retirement brunch I had not wanted to attend. The baby monitor on the counter was still paired to the kitchen speaker, a leftover from when Kieran was an infant, something nobody had thought to unpair, and through the static came Gerald's voice from the back patio, easy and amused, talking to his accountant. He said, "She doesn't even check her own NPI. We could run this another 5 years easy, and if it ever blows, the license is hers, not mine." My hands froze around the glass bottle. The milk was the wrong temperature. I didn't move. I'm going to tell you what happened next, but before I do, I want to ask you to do one small thing. If this story starts to hit close to something you've lived through, drop a comment below and consider subscribing to this channel. We share quiet stories about people who lost everything they thought was theirs and discovered late that someone had been protecting them all along. That's it. No big production, just a small acknowledgement so I know you're out there. Welcome back, by the way, to those of you who have been here before. This channel exists for people who learn the hard way that family is not always the people who share your last name, and that sometimes the person who saves you has already been gone for years. To understand how I got to that kitchen counter, hands frozen around a bottle that was burning the inside of my wrist, you have to go back about 2 months earlier to a storage unit on the wrong side of Broadway, where I almost walked away from the only piece of my grandmother I had left. My grandmother's name was Maeve Hogan, and she raised me from the time I was 9 years old when my parents went around a curve on I-45 in the rain and never came home. I don't remember being told. I remember the smell of her sweater when she picked me up from the police station, wool and lavender, and the lemon hand soap she kept by every sink in her house. She was a small woman with cracked knuckles and a way of folding towels into perfect thirds, and she worked 2 jobs, a hospital cafeteria during the day, a hotel laundry at night, to keep us in a little frame house in Texas City that smelled like cornbread and bleach. She told me more than once, "Roisin, you learn a skill that pays in any town and you never have to ask a man for permission to eat." That's how I ended up in nursing. That's how I ended up, at 22, walking across a stage in a white coat while she sat in the second row in her one good blouse crying without making a sound. She died of pancreatic cancer when I was 28, and for 3 years after that, I paid $112 a month to keep her things in a climate-controlled storage unit because I could not bring myself to open the boxes. In January, I finally went. Kieran was at preschool, the rent on my apartment had gone up again, and I told myself I would sort through what was left and donate the rest. I sat on the concrete floor with a roll of contractor bags, and I opened the first box, and what I found inside undid me. Her good shoes, polished, her recipe cards in a tin, the corners soft from being thumbed. A church bulletin from the Sunday before she went into hospice with her handwriting in the margin, "Pray for Roisin's strength." A cardigan I had given her for Christmas when I was 16, folded in thirds the way she folded every soft thing. I sat there and held the cardigan to my face and smelled lavender and lemon and the ghost of her, and I cried the way you cry when grief ambushes you in a place with bad fluorescent lighting and the rumble of someone else's truck 3 doors down. And then I found the folder. It was wedged behind a stack of photo albums, a manila folder labeled in her careful school teacher print, hospice paperwork, and inside, among the pre-printed intake forms and the medication list, was a single sheet she had filled out herself, in pen, in the days before she stopped being able to hold a pen. At the bottom, in the margin where there should have been a doctor's signature line, she had written, "Roisin, the house is already yours. File drawer, 3rd folder. I love you, don't be scared." I read it 3 times before the words made sense. The house. What house? Her little frame house in Texas City had been sold to pay for the hospice. There was no house. I sat on the cold concrete and held the paper and felt the first crack of something I did not yet understand opening underneath my life. I didn't have time to chase it that week. I had Kieran. I had a 60-hour pay period and a kid with otitis media on Bolivar Peninsula who needed daily visits, and I was the only person who could cover. I tucked the note into my wallet behind my driver's license, told myself I would find the file drawer when I had a weekend, and I drove home. That should have been the end of a quiet week. It wasn't. 3 days later, I logged into the Texas Board of Nursing portal to renew a continuing education certification, and there, under provider affiliations, were 2 business names I had never heard of: Gulf Coast Mobile Health Services, Bayside Provider Solutions, both listed under my NPI, both active. My hands were shaking before I even opened the Medicare portal. My body knew before the numbers loaded. When the screen finally rendered, I sat very still in the dark of my kitchen with a glass of water sweating onto a coaster, and I scrolled. 312 claims, $87,400, 14 months, services I had never rendered, patient names I had never seen, addresses scattered across 4 counties, places I had never driven to, codes for procedures I had not performed, dates that overlapped with my actual shifts where I was already in someone else's house, doing actual work, for actual children. I sat in front of that screen for a long time. The refrigerator hummed, the clock above the stove ticked. Kieran was asleep down the hall, his Spider-Man nightlight throwing a small red glow under his door, and I was 31 years old and a single mother and a pediatric nurse who made $54,000 a year before taxes, and somebody had built an $87,000 fraud out of my name. I called Connor first. Connor is my ex-husband. We were divorced 2 years by then civilly, no drama, joint custody on paper and full custody in practice because Connor's idea of fatherhood involved weekend pickups he canceled an hour late. I called him because the only person in the world I had ever shared my NPI number with casually in the early days of our marriage when I was filling out paperwork at his parents' kitchen table and his father, Gerald, had looked over and said, "Let me help you organize that. I used to run a hospital. I know this stuff." The only people in the world who had ever seen my number written down were the Maddox family. Connor didn't pick up. Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. I called 4 times. On Friday afternoon, his new wife, Tessa, a woman I had met twice, texted me, "Stop harassing us about Dad's business. You signed the papers." I read that text in my car in the preschool parking lot. I read it again. Then I read it a 3rd time because I had not signed any papers. I had signed a divorce decree. I had signed Kieran's school enrollment. I had not, in any conscious moment of my life, signed anything that affiliated me with a mobile health billing company. That weekend, I started pulling threads. I requested the original provider agreements from Medicare. They came in a PDF on the following Tuesday. The signature at the bottom looked nothing like mine. The letters were too round, the H in Hogan dragged down too far, but the printed name read Roisin Elizabeth Hogan. And Elizabeth is my mother's name, my maiden name, middle initial, a name I have not used on a single professional document since I was 22 years old. Only family knew that middle name. Only Connor's family had ever seen it written on a Christmas card my grandmother sent the first year we were married. The notary stamp at the bottom belonged to a Phil Rusk, CPA, Galveston, Texas. I looked him up. Phil Rusk had been Gerald Maddox's accountant for 31 years. I want to tell you about the man I'm describing because if you have only met him through this story, you might think Gerald Maddox is the kind of villain who arrives with red flags pinned to his lapel. He isn't. Gerald is the kind of man who remembers your coffee order. He's 6'1", white-haired, a retired hospital administrator with a Rotary Club pin on his blazer, and the first time I met him, he stood up from his chair, shook my hand with both of his and said, "Connor told us you're a nurse. Thank God. This family needs somebody who actually helps people." For 5 years of my marriage, he praised my work at every dinner. He asked about my patients by initial. He brought me a stethoscope for my 27th birthday. A Littman Cardiology, the good one, $300, and when I cried, he waved it off and said, "Roisin, you're the real thing. Don't ever doubt it." I built a piece of my identity around the approval of a man who, it turned out, was already at that point feeding my NPI number to a billing company he co-owned, generating fraudulent Medicare claims under my credentials, and counting on the assumption that I would never check. That is the part that does not go away. The smile, the stethoscope, the "thank God you're here." I sat at my kitchen table with the forged provider agreement printed out and laid flat in front of me, and I thought about every dinner, every holiday, every time he had asked me how work was going and looked genuinely interested. And I realized he had not been interested in me. He had been interested in the surface area I provided, the license, the number, the clean compliance record. I was infrastructure. I had been infrastructure for the entire marriage and for 2 years after it ended. I called Diane on a Sunday. Diane is Gerald's wife, my former mother-in-law, a woman who never said an unkind word to me, but also never said much of anything at all. A thin, careful woman who set the table beautifully and laughed only when Gerald laughed first. I called her because I wanted to give the family one chance to make this right before I went to the board. I told her gently what I had found. There was a long pause. Then Diane said quietly, the kind of quietly that has been practiced for 40 years. Roisin, honey, Gerald made a mistake, but if this gets out, Connor loses the house. The kids lose their school. Tessa's children, Roisin, they're 8 and 10. You wouldn't want to do that to children. I sat on my apartment balcony in Galveston with the salt air in my hair, and I listened to my former mother-in-law weaponize my love for my stepniece and stepnephew, and I said the only thing I could think of. I said, Diane, he used my name, my nursing license. I'm also raising a child. She said, I know, honey, I know, but you're strong. Connor isn't. Please. I hung up and I cried. Not because she had hurt me, but because I understood suddenly and completely that she had been making the same calculation for 40 years. Cover for Gerald, protect the family, sacrifice the daughter-in-law because the daughter-in-law is strong. I did not yet know that Diane was about to become the most important person in my story. I would not understand that for another 6 weeks. That night, I sat with my grandmother's note in my wallet pressed against my hip, and I missed her so badly I could not breathe. She would have known what to do. She would have said, Roisin, you go to the people whose job it is to handle this, and you do not apologize for taking up their time. 3 weeks later, the Texas Board of Nursing opened a preliminary inquiry into my license. The letter came on a Thursday, certified mail, and I had to sign for it in front of the postal carrier with Kieran on my hip. 60 days to respond. Documentation of every claim, affidavits, a formal statement, the possibility of suspension pending investigation. I read the letter standing in my apartment doorway with my son's small, warm weight against my shoulder, and I felt the floor tilt. I am the only income in this household. I am the only adult in this household. If my license is suspended, I lose my job within 48 hours, and there is no version of my life that survives that. Let me stop the story here for a moment and say something to you directly. If you have ever had someone use your name, your work, your identity to build something that was never yours, and then watch the system treat you as a suspect, comment the word named below so I know you understand what it feels like to defend a life you built honestly. There is a particular exhaustion that comes from being on the wrong end of paperwork you didn't sign, and most people who have not lived through it cannot picture how lonely the inside of that hallway is. If you know, you know. Drop the word, then come back. The story turns from here. The next day, Kieran's preschool called. I was on a home visit in Hitchcock in a single wide with a toddler on home oxygen, and I had to step into the bathroom to take the call. The director's voice was apologetic. She said, Ms. Hogan, I wanted to let you know that Kieran was picked up an hour ago for a lunch outing by his grandfather. He'll be back by 1. I assume that's all right. Mr. Maddox is still on the emergency contact list from the marriage. I stood in a stranger's bathroom and stared at the soap dispenser and felt my pulse climb into my throat. I had not authorized any pickup. I had not been notified. Gerald, who had not seen Kieran in 7 months, had walked into my son's preschool and signed him out for lunch, and the school had let him because of a form I had filled out in 2021 and never thought to update. I drove to the preschool with my hands at 10 and 2 and my jaw locked, and when Kieran came back at 1:08 riding on Gerald's shoulders with a balloon in his fist, my son looked at me and said, Mama, Grandpa says you're in trouble at work. He says he's going to fix everything. Gerald set my son down. Gerald smiled at me, the same smile from the Littman birthday, and he said, Roisin, let's talk. I picked up my child. I walked to my car. I did not speak to him. My son asked me in the car, very seriously, Mama, is Grandpa fixing your work? And I realized, with a cold clarity, that Gerald had already begun rewriting the story for my 4-year-old. That night, after Kieran was asleep, I called the one person at work I trusted enough to tell. Her name is Naya Osi. She is a traveling nurse, 6 years older than me, born in Accra and raised in Houston, and she has the kind of professional spine that comes from working in a field where Black women have to be twice as documented to be half as believed. I told her the whole thing, sitting on my balcony with the Gulf wind moving the wind chimes my grandmother gave me. Naya listened. When I finished, she said, Roisin, I love you. But I'm not risking my license for your family drama. I have my own kid. I have my own bills. I said I understood. I said it was fine. I was not going to ask anyone to bleed for me. We hung up. I sat in the dark for a long time. I thought about my grandmother folding towels in thirds, and I thought about the note in my wallet, and I thought about the file drawer, the third folder, and how I still had not gone to find it. The next morning, Naya called me back at 6:14 a.m. She said, in a voice I had never heard from her, "Send me the company names." I sent them. She went silent. 40 minutes later, she called back. She said, "Roisin." He tried it on me. Gulf Coast Mobile Health Services submitted a registration packet under my NPI in November. It got kicked back because I'd already flagged my number with a fraud alert after a different scam in 2022. I never knew who sent it. It was him. I'm in completely. Tell me what you need. I sat on the edge of my bed with the phone pressed to my face, and I cried in a way that surprised me, because for the first time in 3 weeks, somebody was on my side without asking me to apologize for the size of the problem. That weekend, I went back to the storage unit. I had not forgotten the note. I had been afraid of it in the way you become afraid of small kindnesses when your life is full of large betrayals. I unlocked the unit, pulled the chain on the bare bulb, and went straight to the file cabinet in the back corner. A 4-drawer metal cabinet, olive green, that had sat in my grandmother's bedroom for 30 years and now sat in mine because I could not bear to throw it out. I pulled the 3rd drawer. I counted to the 3rd folder. Inside was a deed. A 2-bedroom cottage in Port Bolivar on a quiet street 3 blocks from the water, deeded to Maeve Hogan in 1998 and transferred to a revocable trust in 2014, with me as sole beneficiary effective on her death. Property taxes paid up through the current year by a small annuity she had set up with a lawyer in League City. There was a key in a small envelope taped to the inside of the folder and a second handwritten note in her familiar slanted hand. It said, "Roisin, I bought this with the insurance money from your parents. I never told you because I didn't want it to feel like blood money. It's yours when you need it. I think you'll need it before you know you need it. Be brave." Gran. I sat on the concrete floor of the storage unit and I held that key in my hand and I made a sound I did not know I was capable of making. She knew. Somehow, my grandmother, a woman who died 3 years before any of this began, who had never met Gerald Maddox in his current configuration, who only knew Connor as a polite young man who held doors, she knew, the way mothers and grandmothers know, that I would one day stand in a place where I needed somewhere to go that no one could take from me. She had bought me a house with the money she got for losing her own daughter. She had held it for 26 years. She had paid the taxes. She had kept it quiet. She had waited. I drove to Port Bolivar that afternoon with the key in the cup holder and Kieran in his car seat singing along to a song about a shark. I parked in front of a small white cottage with blue trim and a screen porch, and I unlocked the front door and I walked into a clean, empty house that smelled faintly of cedar and ocean. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with original 1960s tile, a yard, a small fenced yard with a live oak in the corner, exactly the kind of yard I had been telling Kieran we would have someday when Mama got a raise. I sat on the kitchen floor with my back against the cabinets, and Kieran ran in circles in the empty living room shouting, "Mama, it's big! Mama, it's big!" And I pulled out my wallet and I read my grandmother's first note again. "The house is already yours. File drawer, 3rd folder. I love you. Don't be scared." I sat on that floor and I talked to her out loud. I said, "Gran, you planned for me. You planned for me when I couldn't plan for myself." The afternoon light came through the kitchen window the way it had come through her kitchen window in Texas City, slanted and gold, and for the first time in a month, I felt the shape of a future. A week later, the FedEx box arrived. It was on my apartment doorstep when I came home from a shift on Wednesday, no return address. My name and address printed on a label in a generic font. I stood over it for a long time before I touched it. I had been threatened with a bar complaint by Connor's new lawyer the day before. I had received a hang-up call at 11:40 p.m. from a blocked number. My nervous system was, at that point, a flinch with a person attached. I carried the box inside, set it on the kitchen counter, and did not open it for 48 hours. I was sure it was a trap. I imagined inside it a fake document, a planted item, something designed to discredit me when I brought it to the board. I slept poorly. On Friday morning, before Kieran was up, I sliced the tape with a kitchen knife. Inside, on top, was a folded sheet of personal stationery, pale blue, the kind Diane used for thank you notes. Her handwriting, 3 sentences. "Roisin, I should have done this sooner. I'm sorry it took me 40 years to find my spine." Underneath the note was a stack of documents 3 inches thick. Photocopies, every one of them. the original forged provider agreement with my name, Gerald's co-ownership filings for Gulf Coast Mobile Health Services and Bayside Provider Solutions, filed through a Shell LLC registered in Delaware, bank records showing transfers from the billing companies into a joint account in Gerald and Diane's names, internal emails printed out between Gerald and Phil Rusk discussing which providers to enroll next and which ones were too sharp to risk, a copy of an attempted registration packet bearing Naya Osi's NPI dated November of the previous year, a handwritten log in Diane's careful schoolteacher cursive, almost identical to my grandmother's, which made my chest seize, recording every document Gerald had shredded over the previous 26 months, with the originals attached. Diane had been quietly photocopying her husband's shredder pile for 2 years. She had been waiting for someone to ask. I sat at my kitchen table and I went through every page, and I called Naya and I read her sections of it, and at one point she said very quietly, "Roisin, this is everything. This is the whole thing." I drove to Diane's sister's house in Friendswood that Saturday. Diane had moved out of Gerald's home a week earlier, according to a brief note at the bottom of the stack, and Diane opened the door in a cardigan with her hair undone, and she did not hug me because we had never been the kind of family that hugged. She made me tea. She sat across from me at her sister's kitchen table and she said, "I am not doing this for you, Roisin. I want you to understand that. I am doing this because I have spent 40 years being the paper trail for a man who treats every person around him as infrastructure. I covered for him with his first business partner. I covered for him with the hospital board. I covered for him when his sister tried to warn me. I'm not capable of covering for him while he uses you and your son. That is the line. I found it late. I found it." I told her I understood. I told her I was grateful. She nodded once and looked at the tea. She said, "Use everything I gave you. Do not leave anything out to spare me. I do not deserve to be spared." I want to pause again because I think this is the part of the story that matters most, and I do not want it to slide past. The vault was not a place. The vault was a person. The vault was a quiet woman in a cardigan who had been collecting evidence in a manila envelope at the back of a linen closet for 2 years, while she set the table beautifully and laughed only when her husband laughed first. The world is full of Dianes. They are usually invisible until they decide not to be. I spent the next 2 weeks building the file. I worked with a healthcare fraud attorney in Houston named Marisol Vega, a woman Naya recommended who took my case on contingency once she saw the FedEx box. Marisol's office was on the 11th floor of a glass tower off Westheimer, and the conference room she put me in had a long walnut table that smelled faintly of furniture polish, and a window that looked out over a stretch of freeway shimmering in the heat. She set down a yellow legal pad and a black felt-tip pen between us, and she said very quietly, "Roisin, start at the beginning. I will tell you when to stop." Nobody had ever said that to me before. I told her about the baby monitor. I told her about the milk. I told her about the note in my wallet. She wrote everything down. She did not look up. She did not flinch. The felt-tip pen scratched across the legal pad in a rhythm I found, against my expectation, calming. When I got to the part about the 11 seconds of silence in the board investigator's office, Marisol's pen stopped moving. She looked up at me for the first time. She said, "Good. He counted too." I gave a formal statement to the Texas Board of Nursing investigator, a soft-spoken man named David Pruitt, who took notes by hand and called me ma'am and did not interrupt. He had a thin gold wedding band and a coffee mug from a hospital I had once interned at, and when he sat down across from me, he set his phone face down on the table, which I noticed because I had spent a decade learning to read the small gestures of professional men who were either about to listen or about to perform listening. He was listening. I told him about the patient names. I told him about the 4 counties. I told him about the dates that overlapped my actual shifts. I slid him my GPS logs and my employer's electronic visit verification reports. He read for 9 straight minutes without speaking. The ventilation system clicked on once and clicked off. Outside the office, I could hear a phone ringing unanswered and a woman somewhere laughing at something I could not hear. The carpet under my chair was a flat industrial gray, the kind that hides coffee stains, and I found myself counting the squares in the ceiling tiles above his head, because my body needed somewhere to put its attention while his eyes traveled the pages. I filed a federal Medicare fraud referral with the Office of Inspector General. The intake form was 43 pages long. I filled it out at my kitchen table in 2 sittings with Kieran asleep down the hall and a cup of black tea going cold by my elbow. I sat in Marisol's conference room in Houston for 9 straight hours one Saturday. going through every claim line by line, matching each fraudulent date to my actual GPS-logged work schedule from my employer, building a timeline so airtight that the board investigator, when I delivered it to him on a Tuesday afternoon, set down his pen, closed the folder, removed his glasses, and said nothing for 11 seconds. I counted. I was watching the clock on the wall behind him. 11 full seconds of silence in a beige room with a water cooler humming in the corner. The water cooler made one slow bubble rise and burst, and I watched it the way you watch a small animal cross a road with held breath. Then he said, "Ms. Hogan, we will be in touch within 10 business days. For what it's worth, off the record, this is the cleanest fraud victim file I have seen in 11 years. I walked out into the parking lot in Austin and sat in my car and shook for 20 minutes before I could drive. The dashboard plastic was hot under my palm. A grackle was screaming in the live oak above my windshield. I watched it scream. I let myself feel everything that had been waiting in my chest for 14 months, and I let it move through me, and when it was done, I started the engine and I drove home to my son. Gerald's accountant, Phil Rusk, saw me coming out of the Medicare office in Houston the week before, and he must have texted Gerald because the next morning, Gerald sent Kieran a bicycle. A real bicycle, training wheels included, delivered by a courier to my apartment with a card that read in Gerald's looping handwriting, "Grandpa loves you no matter what Mommy says." Kieran was thrilled. Kieran was 4 years old and did not know that the bicycle was a weapon. He sat on the floor of the entryway and ran his small hands over the blue tassels on the handlebars and said, "Mama, Mama, look, it has bells." I let him keep the bike. I did not let Gerald in. I took a photograph of the card under the kitchen light and I added the photograph to the file. The card itself I placed inside a clear plastic sleeve. I labeled the sleeve with the date in pencil. My hands were steady when I did it. That surprised me. I had rehearsed this steadiness for 6 months without knowing I was rehearsing it. Then Gerald demanded mediation. Through his attorney, he requested a private meeting at the Galveston County Courthouse to settle this matter within the family. Marisol told me I did not have to go. She said the law was on my side, the evidence was on my side, and there was no procedural requirement that I sit in a room with him. I told her I wanted to go. I wanted Gerald to see my face when his life stopped working. She studied me across her walnut table for a long moment, and then she said, "Okay, we go. But you do not speak first. You do not speak at all unless I tap your knee. The documents speak, you watch." The mediation was on a Thursday morning in May. I wore the black blazer I wore to my grandmother's funeral. I put her note in the inside pocket against my chest. I had folded it once along its existing crease, and I could feel the small square of it through the wool. I drove to the courthouse with Marisol in the passenger seat, and we carried the FedEx box, my Medicare records, Naya's attempted registration proof, and a letter from the Board of Nursing confirming my full cooperation and the status of the investigation. The courthouse parking lot smelled like hot asphalt and baywater. A pelican stood on a light pole in the median, not moving as if it had been carved there. I locked my car twice. I checked the doors of the box. I followed Marisol through the metal detector and up a flight of stairs whose handrail was cool against my palm. The marble of the stairwell had a hairline crack running diagonally across the third step. I noticed it on the way up. I would notice it again on the way down. Gerald was already in the conference room when we arrived. He was wearing a navy suit. The lapels were sharp, the shirt was white, the tie was the same red tie he had worn the day he gave me the Littman. The room was on the third floor, narrow, with a long laminate table and 6 chairs and a flag in the corner sagging on its pole. There was a pitcher of water sweating onto a plastic tray. A single fluorescent tube above the table buzzed at the pitch a mosquito makes near your ear at night. Gerald stood up and smiled at me. The same smile, the stethoscope smile. And he said, "Roisin, thank you for coming. I think we can resolve this like adults." His voice was warm. His voice had always been warm. That was the part I had to keep reminding myself was not the truth. Diane was in the gallery outside the conference room, sitting on a wooden bench with her hands folded in her lap. I had not known she would be there. She was wearing the same pale blue cardigan she had worn at her sister's kitchen table. Her hair was pinned back. Her ankles were crossed. She nodded at me. I nodded back. Neither of us smiled. There was no smiling left in either of us for him. I did not sit down. Marisol pulled out the chair beside her and tilted her head toward it, and I shook my head once, a small movement, and she did not press. I stood at the head of the table with my hands at my sides, and I felt the small square of my grandmother's note against my chest, and I let the silence do its work for a full count of 10 before I moved. Gerald's smile twitched at the corner. He glanced at his attorney. His attorney did not glance back. I opened the FedEx box on the conference table, and one by one, in silence, I placed each document in front of Gerald's attorney, the forged provider agreement. I set it down. The co-ownership filings for the two shell companies, I set them down. The bank transfers from the billing accounts into Gerald and Diane's joint account, page after page of them, each transfer highlighted in yellow by Marisol's paralegal. I set them down. The internal emails between Gerald and Phil Rusk with the phrases "too sharp to risk" and "she doesn't even check her own NPI" circled in red. I set them down. Naya's attempted registration packet with her NPI redacted but her name preserved with her written permission. I set it down. The shredder log in Diane's handwriting, 26 months of patient cursive recording what had been fed into the machine and when. I set it down. The board's cooperation letter on official letterhead. I set it down. The OIG referral receipt with its case number running across the top in black. I set that down last. Each document made a small dry sound as it touched the laminate. I had not noticed the sound the first time I rehearsed this in Marisol's office. I noticed it now. It was the sound of a card being placed on a table by a dealer who was not in a hurry. Gerald's attorney read the first 3 documents at normal speed. He slowed down at the 4th. He turned the pages of the bank records with his thumb, and his thumb hesitated, and he glanced up at me once and back down. By the 6th document, he was reading with the specific stillness of a man calculating exposure. His Adam's apple moved. He cleared his throat. He did not read the rest. He stacked them, slowly, with both hands, into a single pile, and he placed his palm flat on top of the pile, as if he were keeping it from blowing away in a wind only he could feel. Gerald watched his attorney's face. Gerald's smile did not move, but the muscles around his eyes began to. There is a particular tightening that happens at the outer corners when a person is realizing something they cannot yet say out loud. I watched it happen in real time. His attorney leaned over and whispered something to him. I could not hear the words. I watched Gerald's mouth open and then close. I watched his hand rise from the table and then settle again. I watched a single bead of condensation slide down the side of the water pitcher and pool on the plastic tray. Gerald said out loud, That's not possible. Where did you get this?" He looked up. He looked past me. He looked through the open door of the conference room, down the short hallway to the wooden bench where his wife of 41 years was sitting with her hands folded in her lap. He saw her. His face changed in a way I will not forget for the rest of my life. It was not anger. It was not even surprise. It was the very particular collapse of a man who has just understood all at once that he has spent his entire life being watched by someone he thought he was watching. He said, "You?" Just the one word, just the syllable. And Diane, sitting on the bench in her cardigan with her hands folded the way my grandmother folded hers, said clearly enough for the room to hear, 40 years, Gerald, I'm done being your paper trail." The room went quiet in a way courthouses are usually not quiet. The fluorescent light above the conference table hummed at a frequency I had never previously been able to hear. A door closed somewhere on the floor below. Gerald's attorney closed the folder in front of him with both hands slowly, and he said, "I'm going to need to speak with my client privately. This meeting is concluded." Gerald did not look at his attorney. Gerald was still looking at Diane. Diane was no longer looking at Gerald. She was looking down at her hands. Her hands were very still. I have never in my life seen a person hold still the way she was holding still. Gerald's mouth moved again. He said her name. He said, "Diane." She did not look up. He said it a second time, smaller. "Diane." She did not look up. 43 seconds passed before anyone in that room moved. I know because Marisol told me later that she had been counting too. I gathered my documents. I put each one back into the FedEx box in the same order I had laid them down because that was how Marisol had taught me to do it. I closed the lid. I picked up the box. Marisol put her hand on my lower back lightly, just once, and I walked out of the conference room. I walked past Diane. I did not stop. She did not expect me to. I felt her eyes lift as I passed and lower again as I reached the stairwell. I walked down the stairs at a normal pace. My hand passed over the hairline crack in the 3rd step. I walked across the lobby at a normal pace. I walked out the front doors of the Galveston County Courthouse and into the white midday light, and the pelican on the light pole was still there, still not moving. I drove home with Marisol in the passenger seat, and neither of us spoke for the first 15 miles, and then Marisol said, "Roisin, he is done. He does not know it yet, but he is done." I nodded. I kept driving. I had a 4-year-old to pick up from preschool. The ferry line was 38 minutes long that afternoon. I sat in my car with the engine off and the windows down, and I listened to the gulls, and I let the salt wind move my hair, and I did not think about Gerald at all. which was, I noticed with mild surprise, the first time in 14 months that I had been able to not think about him. What happened to Gerald after that was gravity, not prosecution. I did not have to do anything else. The OIG investigation triggered an audit of every entity linked to his billing companies. Connor's real estate firm, which shared Phil Rusk as accountant, was flagged within 2 weeks for commingled funds. The Maddox family's 3 Galveston rental properties were frozen pending review. The Rotary Club asked Gerald to step down from the board, citing a bylaw about pending investigations. His name was removed from a donor plaque at the hospital where he had once been an administrator. I heard about it from a nurse I worked with who had walked past the wall and noticed the new putty. Phil Rusk surrendered his CPA license rather than face the board. The $41,000 contribution Gerald had pledged to the hospital's new pediatric wing was quietly returned. Gerald's retirement party photos were still on his Facebook page, him in a paper crown holding a glass of champagne while his assets were locked and his attorney was sending Marisol increasingly polite letters asking whether we might consider a private settlement. We did not respond to the letters. The machinery I had activated ran without me. I did not have to push it. I did not have to gloat. I did not even have to think about him very often, which was, I came to understand, the deepest punishment I could have inflicted. Connor called me twice in June. The first time, he left a voicemail asking if we could talk about Dad. His voice on the recording was thinner than I remembered. I did not call back. I listened to the voicemail twice, standing at my kitchen sink with the tap running, and then I deleted it. The second time, he caught me on a Sunday afternoon when I picked up without looking. His voice was strained. He said, "Roisin, look, I didn't know. I swear to God I didn't know about any of it." I said, "Connor, I believe you didn't know the specifics. I also believe you didn't want to know. Those are different things." He was quiet. I let the silence sit on the line between us. I counted to 20 in my head, the way Marisol had taught me to count when I felt the urge to fill a silence that did not belong to me. He breathed out. He said, Can Kieran and I have lunch sometime?" I said, "When you have done the work to figure out which of those things is true about you, you can call me again and we will talk about Kieran." I hung up. I did not feel triumphant. I felt tired. I felt the specific tiredness of a woman who has just realized that the man she was married to for 5 years is not a villain and not a victim, but simply someone who learned very early that the easiest way through life is to not look closely at anything. Tessa stopped texting. Her last message arrived on a Friday in late June and read only, "I hope you can sleep at night." I read it once. I did not reply. I muted the thread. I went and made my son a grilled cheese sandwich. Diane's sister sent me a card in July thanking me for being kind to Diane in a hard season. The card had a watercolor of a magnolia on the front. The handwriting inside was careful and slanted, almost identical to Diane's, which was almost identical to my grandmother's, which made me wonder briefly whether a generation of women in this country had all been taught the same penmanship by the same kind of strict teacher in the same kind of small classroom. I framed the card and put it on a shelf. Diane and I did not become close. We exchanged Christmas notes that first year, and that was the shape of it. Some debts are not meant to become friendships. They are meant to be acknowledged and carried. In August, I got the letter from the Board of Nursing, full clearance, no findings against my license, formal acknowledgement that the claims under my NPI had been determined to be fraudulent and that I had been the victim, not the perpetrator. The letter was 3 paragraphs long and the most beautiful piece of mail I have ever received. I read it at the kitchen counter in my apartment, and I put my grandmother's note next to it on the counter, and I made myself a cup of tea, and I sat there for a long time with both pieces of paper, the one written in 2014 in a hospice bed in Galveston, and the one printed in 2024 in an office in Austin, and I understood that they were the same letter. Both of them said, "You are who you say you are. We see you. You are safe." I gave notice on my apartment the next week. I packed my life into 17 boxes. Kieran chose the color of his new bedroom himself, green like a turtle, and on a Saturday in September, Naya and her husband and their 12-year-old daughter helped me move my furniture into the cottage in Port Bolivar. Naya's husband was a quiet man with a carpenter's hands, and he fixed the latch on the screen door without being asked. We ate pizza on the kitchen floor. Kieran ran through every room 3 times just to confirm they all still existed. He pressed his palm flat against the wall of his new bedroom and said, "Mine?" And I said, "Yours." And he ran the length of the hallway and back, shrieking with the pure animal joy of a child who has been told that something is his. That night, after he was asleep in his new bed, I sat on the screen porch with a glass of wine and I listened to the Gulf, and I called Marisol and we talked about the recent statistics that nearly 1 in 8 working age adults in the United States is targeted by some form of identity fraud each year, and that medical identity theft alone causes an estimated $2.3 billion in losses annually. And Marisol said, "Roisin, you are a data point now. You are also a person who got her name back. Both of those things are true." I drank my wine. I watched the porch light catch the moths. The Gulf was a low gray sound under everything, the way a heartbeat is a sound under everything if you remember to listen for it. I want to tell you what my life looks like now because I think the people who watch these videos deserve to know that the rebuilding is real and not a movie ending. Kieran starts kindergarten next month at a small public school 3 blocks from the cottage. I still work in pediatric home health, same employer, same patients with a small raise after I pass my recertification with honors. I drive across the ferry every morning. I see dolphins sometimes in the channel. I am dating, very cautiously, a high school history teacher named Wes, who has met Kieran twice and who knows how to ask a question without already having decided the answer. Naya and I had dinner last Thursday. She still calls me Hogan like a coach. Diane moved to Tulsa to live near her sister. Gerald is, as far as I know, living in a 1-bedroom rental in League City while the property litigation continues. I do not look him up. I do not need to. My grandmother's note lives in a small wooden frame on the wall beside Kieran's bed. He cannot read it yet. I read it to him sometimes, in a slightly edited version. He calls her Great-Grand Maeve and tells his preschool teacher she lives at the beach with us, which is, in the only way that matters, true. The cottage smells like cedar and lemon hand soap because I use the same brand she used. I fold towels in thirds. I cannot fold them any other way. The first time I caught myself doing it, alone in my new linen closet, I sat on the floor and cried for 10 minutes, and then I got up and finished the laundry because that is what she would have done. I sit on the screen porch most nights after Kieran's bedtime. The Gulf air is heavy with salt. I hold the note sometimes, taken down from its frame, and I reread her handwriting. The house is already yours. File drawer, 3rd folder. I miss her hands. I miss the way she folded towels in thirds. I miss her cardigan, which is in my closet now and still smells faintly of her, and which I refuse to wash. I miss a woman who planned for me when I could not plan for myself, who bought me a house with money she got for losing her own daughter, who held that house for 26 years and paid the taxes and waited, because she trusted that one day I would need somewhere no one could take from me, and she did not want me to have to ask. I cry sometimes sitting on that porch, not from sadness. From the specific grief of being loved by someone who is gone and knowing that her love arrived exactly when I needed it, like a hand under my elbow as I stumbled. I used to think love was the people who showed up at the dinners. I was wrong. Love is the people who set things up so that you would be okay, even if they could not show up. Love and trust are different things, and I confused them for a long time. I trusted Gerald because he smiled at me and praised my work, and I mistook the trust for love. I did not always trust my grandmother because she was strict and worked too much and was sometimes too tired to listen. But she loved me. She loved me in the language of paid taxes and quiet deeds and a folder in the 3rd drawer of a green metal cabinet. That is the language I am trying to learn to speak now, to my own son. Not the language of smiles, the language of arrangements, the language of making sure. If you are watching this and somebody is using your name to build something you did not consent to, your work, your license, your credit, your identity, please understand that you are not crazy, you are not paranoid, and you are not alone. Document everything. Talk to a lawyer who specializes in your specific kind of fraud. File the federal complaint. Cooperate fully with any licensing board. And if there is a Diane somewhere in your story, a quiet witness who has been collecting receipts in a linen closet because they could not bring themselves to act sooner, be ready to receive what they send you with both hands, even if it arrives with no return address and 48 hours of suspicion attached. That is the story. 1 folder in a 3rd drawer, 1 FedEx box with no return address, 1 handwritten note in a wooden frame beside a sleeping child's bed. If any of this hit close to something you have lived, please drop a comment below and tell me what you heard in your own story. I read them, especially the long ones, especially the ones written late at night. If you are new to this channel, subscribe so the next quiet story finds you when you need it. And if you know somebody in the middle of defending a life they built honestly against people who built nothing and took everything, send this their way. They might need to hear that the rescue sometimes comes from a person who has been gone for years